Hello, everyone. If you saw that video right now and you're tuning in, is from Hama in 2011. My name is Yazan al-Saadi, and I'm a Syrian Canadian writer based in Beirut.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shiyam Galyon. I'm a Syrian writer and the communications coordinator at War Resisters League. I'm also based in Texas, and so we're all hoping my electricity doesn't go out. But thank you all for being here. Welcome. Welcome to the Syrian Revolution 10 years on. What does the future hold? We would like to thank our sponsors, Global Campaign of Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, Revive the Peace Movement, World Without Prisons, Internationalism from Below, Alliance of Middle Eastern Socialists, Middle Eastern North African Socialists, and War Resisters League for making this event possible.
Syria had been the focus of much regional and global attention following the massive eruption of popular revolt in mid-March 2011. The Syrian Revolution gradually developed into a war involving multiple local, regional, and international actors. As a result, the revolution and its massive protest movement, as well as the resistance from below that have sustained them, has been mostly ignored, sidelined, or silenced. Narratives centered around global political rivalries and sectarian conflicts have dominated much of the international and Western discourses on Syria, denying the inherent agency, the will of everyday people, resisting fascism, dictatorship, and imperialism, and trying to shape the societies they live in.
And so what we mean by that is any narrative that focused on the actions of state to overshadow the work of, for example, the local coordinating committees, the many committees and civilian-led councils taking ownership of local politics and local organizing, the consistent weekly Friday protests, the many new media ventures, so like Radio Fresh in Kafr Nabal, the magazine Inab Baladi, and it's like that's what we mean when we say to center civilian agency. We need to really put the focus of the narrative on what the people are doing.
Well said. One of the things we did to push back against these narratives is that we organized a series of online summer institutes titled The Syrian Revolution, A History from Below, that included presentations from activists, organizers, academics, and writers who discussed an array of topics ranging from grassroots movements, imperialism and anti-imperialism, political economy, feminist struggles, the prison system, the weaponization of healthcare, Palestinian solidarity, Kurdish self-determination, and the future of the Syrian and regional uprisings. To view this series of Syria's past and present, please check out the Syria Revolt website, and you can find the link to these lectures in the description.
Thanks, Yazan. Now we shall turn our gaze to the future, one where all political prisoners are released, medical infrastructure is protected and strong, and refugees are able to return with dignity, and a future where Syria and Syrians are active in liberation struggles at home and around the world. Marking more than a decade since uprisings erupted in Syria and elsewhere in the region and the world, it's crucial we continue to build upon all of the work that I mentioned earlier to plan, prepare, and coordinate resistance against fascism and imperialism. In this spirit, we announced the event called The Syrian Revolution 10 Years On, What Does the Future Hold? To commemorate the Syrian uprising and other social movements for self-determination and dignity, we will listen to revolutionary songs, watch footage from the archives, and hear different voices talking about the present and what needs to be done for the future. The future is ours, not theirs.
Indeed. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Leila Shami. She's a Syrian writer and has worked with human rights movements in Syria and across the West Asian North African region. She is the co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, and a founding member of Tahrir ICN, a network that aimed to connect anti-authoritarian struggles across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Leila, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me and to all of those who are tuning in to participate in this discussion. I was asked to give an overview of the current situation in Syria today, and from the vast array of issues that we could talk about, I picked two issues to look at the socio-economic situation and also Iran's role and presence in Syria. The reason I chose these issues is that today's webinar is forward-looking, and these issues are here to stay with us for the foreseeable future. And secondly, because it refutes the currently popular discourse that Assad has won, and shows that his control over the country is incredibly fragile. The socio-economic situation in the country is desperate and is affecting communities across Syria, with 83% of Syrians living below the poverty line and struggling to make ends meet, or even afford the basic necessities. The UN's World Food Programme reports that food prices have increased by 376% since October 2019. The price of bread, a staple, has increased 247% since last year. There are shortages of basic foods and fuel, and electricity blackouts are common. The Syrian currency has completely collapsed. The salary of a state employee is now equivalent to around $20 per month, as opposed to $400 per month in March 2011. This situation has caused widespread anger amongst the population, even among communities seen as being loyal to the regime. We've witnessed periodic protests against the regime due to the economic situation, and a number of pro-Assad commentators have actually been arrested due to their criticism of the economic situation and the regime's handling of it. There's a number of reasons for the current situation. The primary reason, of course, is the whole-scale destruction of the country by the regime and its Russian ally, including physical infrastructure, housing, agricultural land and production facilities. The scale of regime corruption and the rampant crony capitalism, which enriches the pockets of those individuals connected to the regime, and which was a problem prior to the uprising, has since been greatly exacerbated. For example, the way in which regime loyalists or family members of the president have been awarded lucrative contracts to construct luxury residential areas when a significant proportion of the population no longer has access to housing. Another example could be the Russian company that has been granted 70% of all revenues generated from the production and export of phosphate, which is equivalent to millions of dollars annually over the next 49 years being siphoned out of the country and given to Russia as a reward for its support for the regime. The economic and financial crisis in Lebanon has also exacerbated the situation, as many Syrian businessmen and individuals deposited savings in Lebanon. For example, the current wheat shortage was compounded by this because all of the main wheat importers have their bank accounts in Lebanon. Also, many Syrians were dependent on remittances from Syrian workers in Lebanon, many of whom have now lost their employment. The situation is also further exacerbated by the current wide-ranging sanctions on the country, which have increased since the US brought in the Caesar Act in late 2019. Unlike previous sanctions, which have widespread support from Syrians, which targeted those individuals affiliated to the regime, either political, military, or security figures, these sanctions are much more controversial, as they also target business and sectors dealing in oil, electricity, IT, and other sectors, and contribute to a shortage of goods and services, which negatively impacts on the civilian population. Whilst humanitarian aid is exempt from sanctions, many NGOs have reported being affected, as people are now very nervous to do business with Syria. However, we need to be very careful because some people are using the sanctions issue to rehabilitate the regime and not hold it accountable for its crimes. So we need to be very clear that sanctions are not the main cause of the current socio-economic crisis. And finally, the coronavirus pandemic has also had an impact because Syrians are totally dependent on humanitarian aid, and donor countries are cutting their budgets because of the financial pressures on them at home. So to turn to Iran, I think it's fair to say that parts of the country are now living under Iranian occupation. Iran has supported the regime since the early days of the conflict. It sees Syria as a key part of the axis of resistance towards the US and Israel, a Shia bloc crossing Iraq, Syria, Lebanon to the Mediterranean. So losing control of Syria or the regime would be a huge strategic loss to Iran's interests in the region. Whilst Iran has supported large numbers of fighters in Syria, with sectarian Shia militias from Iraq, Lebanon, Iraq and Afghanistan, and has established numerous military bases, it's also been the main backer of the regime financially and economically. Since 2013, Iran's provided Syria with credit lines to import fuel and other goods and is a major trading partner. Iran is expanding its presence in Syria and seeks to embed itself in Syrian society in a way that Russia does not. It also appears to be cementing its presence economically in order to ensure it maintains influence in the event of a peace deal, which would call on all foreign militia to leave. So part of its strategy is buying up real estate, which it's doing in Damascus, Homs, Deir ez-Zor and Aleppo. Properties of Syrians who have been displaced by the conflict are now inhabited by members of Iranian-backed militia and their family. Land belonging to displaced Syrians has been auctioned off at symbolic prices in areas such as Homs, and the main buyers are members of Iranian-backed militia. In Damascus, for example, people report that there's a noticeable change in demographics, such as areas of Bab Tuma and Bab Sharki, which previously had a large Christian community and now have a very heavy presence of members of Iranian militia. Even shop signs and adverts are now often written in Farsi. People are selling their properties to Iranians due to the desperate economic situation, and in some cases because they're unable to return to their homes. Lucrative contracts have been awarded to Iranian companies for reconstruction and infrastructure. Iran also has a soft power strategy, establishing Iranian cultural and education centres and encouraging people to convert to Shiism, and it also tries to buy loyalty. Iranian militias can pay Syrian youth up to $700 a month, whereas the Syrian army only pays $40. Whilst many Syrians cannot return to their home country, the regime has fast-tracked naturalisation of foreigners to ensure Iranians and others can become citizens. So it's really becoming clear that the forced displacement of oppositional communities and the repopulation of those areas with communities perceived as loyal was part of a deliberate strategy by the regime to change demographics and to ensure a loyal constituency in areas it controls. It appears that one reason there is a political stalemate is that the regime is in fact buying time to create facts on the ground in its favour. So I'll just finish by saying that anti-Iranian sentiment in Syria is at an all-time high. Iranian policy in Syria and also in Iraq has vastly increased the Sunni sense of victimhood, which is a contributing factor in the rise of extremist jihadist groups. The Iranian presence has also led to repeated bombing of Syria by Israel on Iranian targets, as Israel doesn't want an Iranian presence on its northern border. So to link back to my introduction, I think the withdrawal of Iran would lead to a significant weakening of the regime. And this is why the Assad regime has not won. It's completely dependent now on foreign powers to run the country and cannot manage the massive economic crisis engulfing the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leila. While I was listening to you share with us kind of this overview, I was thinking about how, as a US-based person who's committed to anti-war and anti-military struggles, it is just so important that those who are working for justice for the Iranian people be linking up and coordinating for the people who are working on justice for Syrian people. And it extends further. People who are working on Lebanese and Palestinian issues need to be coordinating together. On this theme, to take it to even bigger, I think healthcare and the status of health across the region in the various war zones also is what links us together. And so I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest, Dr. Zaher Sahloul, who is a critical care specialist at Christ Advocate Medical Center in Chicago. Dr. Sahloul is the immediate past president of and senior advisor to the Syrian American Medical Society, a humanitarian and advocacy organization that provides medical relief to Syrians and Syrian refugees. He was recently in Syria and Yemen. Welcome, Dr. Zaher.
Well, thank you, Shiyam. Thank you for having me. And by the way, we founded 4 weeks ago an organization called MediGlobal, where we provide healthcare in disaster regions, including Syria, of course, but Yemen, Gaza, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Lebanon, Sudan, Colombia, and Ecuador, and the United States. And we believe in a world that does not have healthcare disparity. And I think COVID pandemic have highlighted healthcare disparity, especially within our country here in the US, and also at the global level. So it's very important for us to support such undertaking. But I'm privileged really to be within this conference, especially with I think the intensified disinformation campaign that Yazan and Shiyam have hinted to in the beginning, mostly at the left, but also you see parallel to it in the ultra-right groups within the United States. And recently, I signed a letter that was written by Yasin al-Saleh, and the title of the letter is "Raising People Through Disinformation," raising Syrian people through disinformation. Was signed by more than few hundred influencers from Syria and 35 different countries. And it described this effort by people in the left, like Max Blumenthal, Rania Khaliq, um, Vanessa Beasley, and others. Unfortunately, some of them are well-known um, um, influencers in the left, of being the propaganda campaigns that is leading the unprincipled and the lazy and the fools, and we've seen that every time when Syria is in the news, that you have a barrage of Twitters and tweets by people on the left accusing Syrians of being imperialist, accusing the United States of intervening in Syria, and ignoring the brutality and the crimes of Russia and Iran and the regime. So the antidote of this campaign is to be principled, to have values, shared values, that whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jew or Buddhist or Hindu or have no religion, I think we all agree about the values of humanity and the protection of civilians and protections of children, to be well read and diligent about what you tweet and what you retweet, and to be also smart. That's the antidote of the unprincipled and the lazy and the fools who are waging this campaign. By the way, I'm a critical care specialist. I've been busy last year treating COVID patients, and like many physicians in the United States, and 1% of our doctors in the US are of Syrian origin. That's a huge number for a small country, that their best export to the United States actually physicians who've been healing millions of fellow Americans in the last year and previous years, who are some of the best subspecialists and specialists in healthcare. And sometimes when we talk about Syria, we think of refugees and crises, but we ignore the contribution of Syrian Americans to the welfare of our country here. So happy Doctors Day. Yesterday was the International Doctors Day. And especially for people who are on the front line in healthcare here in the US and everywhere else. I came recently, as Shiyam mentioned, from Idlib in a medical mission, and this is my, I think, 16th medical mission to north of Syria. Last time was at the peak of the bombing campaign that waged by the Assad regime and Russia at Idlib, that led to the displacement of 1.2 million people in northwest of Syria. Idlib province has 4.2 million people. Half of them have been displaced from different cities like Aleppo and Homs and Damascus and Dar'a and other places, and Hama. They're still displaced. The people who were displaced last year are still displaced. None of them returned to Ma'arat al-Nu'man and Saraqib and Khan Sheikhoun that are under the control of the regime. They're ghost towns right now. But also I found signs of resilience, and this is actually I would say this is the most positive trip that I had. Students are going to school. Students are going to universities. There are new businesses being created. The roads are clean. There are more signs of vibrant civic society in northwest of Syria. And there are more shopping centers. There are more restaurants. I ate the best food in Idlib. I gained actually a few pounds when I came here. Syrian food is the best food in the world, as everyone knows. And also, I found people thinking of the future, because they had this window of opportunity without bombing for the last a few months at least, because of the COVID crisis. And yes, COVID hit Syria really hard a few months ago, and now we're seeing the third surge of COVID, especially in Damascus region. But in general, Idlib was spared the worst of the crisis, and I think this goes to the credit of the organization that have been supporting healthcare, including SAMS and USAM and MedGlobal and SEMA and others, and also to the local brave doctors and nurses who are continuing to provide healthcare to their community in spite of the risk on their lives. And when we talk about the Syrian revolution and the Syrian crisis, we should always think of the healthcare providers, because what happened in Syria is unparalleled in terms of attacks on healthcare. I mean, we always have crises. I've been in Yemen, I've been in Gaza, I've been in other places that went through war, Sierra Leone and others. But there is no such country that had this systematic attacks on healthcare providers like what happened in Syria. According to Physicians for Human Rights, more than 580 hospitals were bombed. Let me repeat this: 580 hospitals, including a hospital that was bombed last week by Russia, according to the United Nations. And this is a hospital that the organization that is supporting shared its GPS coordinates with the United Nations Security Council to protect the hospital. So basically, it's telling Russia, this is a hospital, please do not bomb. And what happened? Russia bombed that hospital last week, coinciding with the discussion about the humanitarian situation in Syria this week. And this happened 580 times. 940 doctors and nurses were killed in Syria. And let me repeat that. 940 doctors and nurses were killed in Syria, including Dr. Hassan al-A'raj, whom I met in his hospital that called the Central Cave Hospital in Syria, Mashfa al-Maghara al-Markazi. He's a cardiologist north of Hama. His hospital was bombed in Kafar Zeta, and he wanted to build another hospital to serve his community. The villages in Kafar Zeta told him, please do not build the hospital inside the village because we will be bombed. Imagine. So he had to build the hospital inside a mountain, in a cave, to serve his community. I'm not talking about serving fighters. I'm talking about serving patients who have heart disease, chronic diseases, diabetes, dialysis, and so forth. I visited this hospital myself and met with Dr. Hassan al-A'raj. And he was telling me, and he was treating a patient, a woman who had irregular heartbeats at that time in the intensive care unit. When you are inside the hospital, you are like any hospital in Chicago. So you see the monitors, you see the ventilators, you see the pharmacy. You look up, and then you have the ceiling of a cave. You go out the hospital, you exit the building, and you're in front of a mountain. And he was telling me, Dr. Hassan al-A'raj, that he wanted to transform this hospital to a museum after the war, because he wanted to show the world the extent that Syrian healthcare professionals went through to provide healthcare to their communities, because they knew that if they leave their communities, the community will leave. So when we talk about what happened to Dr. Hassan al-A'raj, after 2 months after I saw him in the hospital, while he was leaving the hospital, his car ambulance was hit with a heat-seeking missile, which was fired by a Russian jet. He died, like the 940 doctors and nurses that were killed in Syria. And we have too many stories like that. And in spite of that, we don't see medical organizations or universities or colleges talking about the plight of Syrian doctors and nurses. You can see sometimes hear about that in the media once in a blue moon, but we don't see this solidarity that we expect with the Syrian doctors and nurses who are on the front line of defending medical neutrality. When I graduated from medical school, like every medical graduate, we swear that we'll protect our patients and will provide care in spite of the risk. This is called medical neutrality. And you are protected by ethics, by the norms, by international humanitarian legal system, law, Geneva Conventions that guarantee that every doctor and nurse and ambulance and hospital should be protected in the time of war, even if they are providing health care to the injured soldiers. That's called medical neutrality impartiality, guaranteed by Geneva Conventions for 150 years. In spite of that, we are seeing systematic attacks on healthcare and medical neutrality. The people who are defending that are the Syrian doctors and nurses in Idlib, in Aleppo, in Homs in the past, in Dar'a and other places, and we are not defending them. I mean, we talk about the toll of the crisis on Syria. This is a crisis of displacement, of course. I don't have to mention that half of the population have been displaced. 6 million People are still refugees. In the last 4 years of the Trump administration, and people do not know this information because it was not in the news. We did not see droves of Syrians marching through Europe. So it wasn't in the news. 1/3 of the Syrian population were displaced in the last 4 years. 1/3 of the population of Syria were displaced in the last 4 years of the Trump administration. They were displaced from Ghouta to Idlib, from Dar'a to Jordan and other places, from Aleppo to Idlib and other places. In the last year, 1.2 million people. For every 1 refugees who returned to Syria, according to the United Nations in the last year, 4 were displaced. For every 1 person who returned to Syria, 4 were displaced. This is a crisis that destabilized the European Union. The large number of Syrian refugees who went to Europe, because they had to, they were fleeing terror that was unparalleled before. They were fleeing bombs, barrel bombs. I just wrote an article about the impact of barrel bombs on Syria. This is an invention that was invented by an evil man, by an evil system. Barrels stuffed with TNT, fertilizers, shrapnel, metal parts, nails. It's very cheap, cost about $100, thrown from helicopters on civilian areas. I've seen them. I've seen the impact of these barrel bombs. Weapons of mass destruction. They're dumb bombs. I mean, they're not guided. They fall on hospitals, on buildings, on schools. They mutilate, they kill. People bleed to death. They destroy schools and hospitals and even chicken farms and other places that will make people, stay in their villages. When you destroy a building after building after building, school after school after school, people leave. That's the origin of displacement. The way to address this issue of displacement in Syria is not by sending humanitarian assistance, is by stopping the bombs, that are thrown from helicopters, not by sending band-aids. People will flee anyway. I mean, even if you send them hundreds of millions of dollars to build hospitals, when the hospitals are destroyed, people will leave. That's what happened in Syria over and over and over the past 10 years. According to a recent study, Syria has lost $1.2 trillion in loss of GDP. $1.2 trillion, which is 1 followed by 12 zeros. That's the equivalent of the budget of the European Union for 10 years. Every family in Syria was affected by the crisis. And in spite of that, we don't see the international community, besides the words and the condemnations and the anxiety and so forth, moving to end this crisis once and for good. If the United States made this a priority, ending the crisis, instead of sending $12 billion in humanitarian assistance, which is good, and we welcome this, and thank you very much for the generosity of the American public and the administration, instead of spending $44 billion on war, on the extremists, which is side effects of the crisis, why don't you just sit with the Russian and end this crisis? I mean, everyone knows what's the solution. Everyone knows. You can talk with any taxi driver in Syria or idiot in the street, and we'll tell you what's the solution. People went to the street, similar to the people in Myanmar who are going to the street right now. They wanted to have democratic reform. They wanted to have the same freedom that we have in this country. They wanted to be dignified, to be treated with dignity. And the Assad regime responded with brutality, with snipers, the same way that we are seeing right now what's happening in Myanmar. The regime over there, the army is responding by shooting at the demonstrators. More than 500 demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators in Myanmar so far were killed. And we started to see people fleeing to Thailand in Myanmar, the same way that we've seen the same thing happen in Syria. So when you don't stop brutal regimes, other brutal regime will learn from them and will do the same thing. And it's repeated over and over and over. The solution is not to condemn. The solution is to prevent this regime from killing its people. People wanted to have freedom and dignity, like everyone else. They wanted to have a future for their children. They wanted to have healthcare. They wanted to have education. So I'm sorry that I went in tangent. I know that my time is ended, but let me just end with this. What I've seen in Idlib. What I've seen is really signs of resilient community. Give Syrians a window, and they will create a heaven in the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doctor. That was a very passionate presentation on your part. Reflecting on what you're saying, there are so many things to unpack. When you're talking about, and your point of Syria and the targeting of medical workers and infrastructure rings true. My understanding is that, yeah, Syria is one of the largest in terms of targeting. And your final statement about how not stopping brutal dictators will encourage other brutal dictators rings true to me as well. When I think about the history of targeting medical infrastructures, it's undeniable the parallels that we've seen historically in places like Iraq, where American imperialism and occupation has devastated the medical healthcare infrastructure, including the Saddam dictatorship and what its role was in devastating the institutions there. And I think of Yemen or Bahrain, and how in Bahrain the regime had targeted doctors. And this makes me think about how the medical institutions and workers in general are often at the front lines. There is a lot of, dare I say it, revolutionary potential with medical work. And it's very interesting to see what type of organizations can develop in our region to deal with that, because it really collides with politics. Moving on, in terms of another important topic that we want to bring up, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to bring up our next speaker, who is Wafa Mustafa. Wafa is a Syrian journalist and activist who campaigns for the release of Syrian detainees. She's a member of Families for Freedom and has extensively lobbied the United Nations Security Council and other institutions to call for the release of the names and locations of all those that the Syrian authorities have in captivity. She and her group have called for the release of all detainees in Syria, whether they are held by the Assad regime or by opposition groups. You can clarify what I last said, Wafa. Please take it away. And good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Yazan. Well, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I was actually a member of Families for Freedom, which is a women-led movement that campaigns for the freedom of Syria's disappeared. And that was for like 2 years and a half, but I'm not anymore. In this period, I'm campaigning on my own capacity. But anyway, thank you, Yazan, and thank you everyone for being here today. It's tonight, almost in Berlin. My name is Wafa Ali Mustafa. I'm a Syrian journalist and activist from the city of Masyaf, Western Syria. 30 years ago, my dad gave me a name of a Palestinian news agency. And by this, he marked me and shaped the entire identity I built afterwards. Me and my dad went to my first protest at the age of 10 in solidarity with different causes. My dad started this journey that lasted for years and included traveling for hours every week to the capital Damascus to participate in protests that supported different causes like Palestine and Iraq. I still remember when I was at this protest in Damascus, and I was 14 back then, the regime's forces attacked the protest, and the image that is stuck in my mind is when my dad was beaten by a wooden stick, and he just told me to run, and I ran. My dad raised us, my 2 sisters and myself, to actually be political, to ask questions, to always get involved, and to work very hard for our communities. So in 2011, I was protesting in front of the Libyan embassy, and many people actually were there in solidarity with protesters in Libya, but we were also there for us and for Syria. People started at some point chanting traitor A traitor kills his own people, and then the security forces of the regime knew it too, and thus they attacked the protest and arrested many people. On that day, the journey my dad started when I was born took a different turn when an officer of the Syrian intelligence slapped me and said, "You Palestinians shouldn't involve in internal Syrian affairs." And the reason for that slap was actually a necklace of the Palestinian map I had worn for 10 years, and I had to take off after that day. So when the revolution in Syria started, it wasn't a question for me. It's not that I sat down and thought, shall I participate in this or not? It was just this sense that it started, so I should just be there. And I believe that was the case for many others. I was detained with my sister, my cousin, and 2 of my friends in September 2011, where I was in the middle of my 3rd university year of studying journalism and media in Damascus. At the same time, my dad was actually arrested in another city, and that is the city of Hama. We were both, or all actually, released later. However, on the 2nd of July 2013, my dad was forcibly disappeared by the Syrian regime again, but this time in the city of Damascus. And today actually marks 2,829 days since he was taken from us. As many other Syrians, we haven't seen him since, and we have never been told why he was taken from us or what he was charged with. And unfortunately, it's a bitter truth that my dad's case is far from an isolated case, because more than 130,000 people, at least, are believed and documented to be detained and forcibly disappeared in Syria, and the majority is taken by the Syrian regime. The regime worked and still works more than ever to win not just the military war, but also the war over competing narratives. We've all seen how the narrative on Syria has slowly shifted. The discourses surrounding Syria now revolved around fear-mongering, presenting the narrative of the crisis both nationally and internationally as another war on terrorism rather than a struggle for freedom. In the light of this situation, for years I've been asking myself, how will the narrative of the revolution be remembered in the coming years? How will it be remembered by the Syrians and also by the international community? And how will the spirit of the revolution be kept present in line with a history of peaceful uprisings? Well, after 10 years on the Syrian revolution and after almost 8 years on my dad's enforced disappearance, I've realized why the regime, in any regime, uses detention and enforced disappearance against its own people. Because by detaining someone, Al-Saadi regime and all dictatorships do not only silence and disappear those who are in prisons and detention centers, but they also break their loved ones, their families, and their communities. However, years ago, I've chosen to resist this forgetfulness that the regime has imposed on me by disappearing my dad, and I've chosen to resist it with my memory and thus contributing to shaping a counter-narrative to that of the regime supported by Russia. For years now, I've been trying on a daily basis to tell the whole world what it means to wake up one day and realize you have lost your dad or a loved one. The high price that people, not just in Syria, but in many other places, are paying only for demanding basic human rights should not be normalized or denied. I, alongside many others, have been and will still campaign for the freedom of our loved ones in Assad, in all other prisons in Syria, for justice for Syria and for Syrians. I will end by saying that everything I do today is to secure that my dad's freedom will be achieved one day. So we might, both of us, actually have the chance to protest together again for a better Syria. Lastly, there are many of us who still believe our hope is not an illusion and that change can happen. We all know by now that freedom is difficult and slow, but it's not impossible. Thank you.
Wafa, thank you so much for those words. My response to that is emotional. I think it was very personal and well said, and we would like to really thank you for that. It's not easy what you're going through, and it's really appreciated that you are able to articulate this. So thank you. In light of what Wafa presented and reflecting on all the people who are in prison or have disappeared, we've selected a short video that Amnesty International had produced in 2017 about Sednaya prison. For those who don't know, Sednaya prison is a very notorious hellhole for human beings. We're going to try and play this video at the moment. It's about 3 minutes long. There could be technical difficulties. Please note that we're all volunteers, so I would like to apologize if there are any technical issues ahead of time. Thank you very much. And like I said, the technical difficulties are there. We'll see if we can sort that out. Apologies for that, everyone. It seems like we're still dealing with technical difficulties, so I think perhaps it's best to move on. But we would like to share this link, so maybe if our let's see.
All this for what? Because I was critical of Assad and his cohort. I didn't take up arms. I didn't kill anyone. All I did was to go to a couple of demonstrations. So many of us went peacefully. I'm so hungry. It's been at least 3 days since I ate something. I don't know if Khalid will make it through the night. He's so weak. They beat him so much. I miss my family. It's been a year since I last held my little boy Ali. He's only 4. I wonder where he is. Is my wife Amal cooking on her own? The gods are here, and they are calling out names, including mine. I'm being transferred to a civilian prison. Anything is better than Sednaya. But what about Khalid? Why aren't we leaving? Why are we being taken to solitary cells? It's so cramped. It's okay. Soon we will be in a better place. I can't take these new beatings. It has never been so bad. Are we really being transferred? Or is this our last punishment? We are on the move. We stopped. Why? We're in another building. They grabbed my finger. They're taking my fingerprints. What? I can't believe it. They tell me I've been condemned to death and ask if I have any last wish. I've done nothing wrong. They said I was being transferred. I'm supposed to be transferred. Dear God, protect my family.
I'm really glad that that video was included in the program. And yeah, it's emotional to watch, very emotional to have that be, you know, to really like engage in that story. I myself and almost every other Syrian I know has a family member, at least one person, a family member, a friend who has been touched by the Syrian prison systems. And also like knowing people who the last, you know, that we've heard of them is that they were at Sayed Naya prison. I'm very proud to work at an organization like the War Resisters League, where our politics, you know, they're rooted in the principles of resisting war, the root causes of war at home and abroad. We're putting out a call for submissions on authoritarianism, and we're looking at the connection between the military, the prison system, and authoritarianism. I think the work of World Without Prisons and the prison abolition movement has potential to unite liberation struggles across borders. And like Wafa shared with us, and this video, you know, illustrated just how central, you know, the issue of prisons and incarceration is to Syrian liberation. I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest, Sara Abbas, who is a Sudan-born journalist and researcher, a doctoral candidate in political science, and a feminist who researches social movements in Sudan. Welcome, Sara. She has written numerous articles for Transition Magazine, Open Democracy, and The Nation on the revolutionary processes in Sudan, the region, and elsewhere. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shiyam, and thank you to all the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so moved by the interventions that came before me and also the videos. And yeah, it's also emotional for me to watch, so I can't imagine you know, how it feels actually for Syrians to watch it. We have some similarities. I'll leave it at that, and then maybe I'll pick up on that a bit later. I want to start by paying respect to Wafa's father, to Samira Khalil, and to all the revolutionaries from Syria, both in and out of the country, as well as to those whom we lost. They've fought such a hellish battle this last 10 years, and their courage, strength, and perseverance is an inspiration to so many of us in the Middle East and in Africa, not just to Syrians. I want to go back briefly, very briefly, to a moment in 2018, specifically to December 2018. That month, the former president of my country, Sudan, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, visited Damascus, becoming the first Arab League leader to meet with Bashar al-Assad since the outbreak of the war in Syria in 2011. Assad was, of course, at the time, as he often is, was in the midst of bombing large parts of Syria with the help of his Russian and Iranian allies. His friend, Omar al-Bashir, had similarly been engaging for decades, since the early 90s, in brutal military campaigns against Sudanese people in the regions, first in South Sudan, but also later in the Nuba Mountains, in Blue Nile, and in Darfur. I looked back yesterday at what official sources reported at the time about this meeting, right, which was in December 2018. And in this kind of course, the typically surreal way that we are familiar with, they discussed, quote, situations and crises faced by many Arab countries, end of quote, and stressed the need to build, quote, new principles for inter-Arab relations based on the respect of the sovereignty of countries and non-interference in internal affairs. At that moment, in December 2018, both the Sudanese and the Syrian people shared a distinction in common. I mean, of course, there's many authoritarian and brutal regimes in the region. I think one thing we do have in common with the Syrians is that we've both faced genocidal regimes that are essentially willing to wipe out millions of lives to cling to power. Just a few days prior to that visit, protests had broken out. Scattered protests had broken out in Sudan, in different cities, in Ad-Damazin, one of the war-targeted cities. And if I can just go off on a tangent here briefly, I'm trying to get used to saying things like war-targeted as opposed to war-affected. At least in Sudan, the discourse of the development in the humanitarian industry is very powerful. And I'm trying to resist this kind of discourse because I think it's designed to depoliticize violence, right? To make it seem as if this violence is somehow a natural disaster, right? As opposed to a deliberate man-made war crime. So in these small cities, these small protests at the time were happening. So Sudanese public opinion was very focused on that. But the visit by al-Bashir to Assad was very much I think it led to this kind of head shaking at the time because, having been ruled by the Bashir regime, by his military, by his paramilitaries, by his party for close to 3 decades, it was just another sign for us of the depravity of the regime, that it would go to Syria and legitimize what Bashar al-Assad is doing there and his regime was doing there. But also that it was just another, that conclusion had been reached several years prior, but that, reform was not the pathway. We had to overthrow this regime because it was so morally corrupt. And at the time, reform was the preferred, I would say, pathway of many Western nations who had hoped that the regime would kind of soften its edges up a bit, but essentially remain doing the great job that it does in migration control and etc. Of course, those small protests that were taking place in Ad-Damazin and in Atbara grew by leaps and bounds in the weeks that followed and became a full-blown uprising, a full-blown revolution, as we call it as well, the third in our history since our independence in 1956. And by April 2019, al-Bashir had fallen. I wouldn't say his regime has, but he definitely him and the top lieutenants had been brought down by this mass nonviolent actions. And then, I don't have time to go into all the details that I think are familiar to most of the viewers, but essentially we reached a deal between civilians and the military, and it set into motion a transitional period in Sudan. So we're about 1.5 years into this so-called transitional period. And of course, there's a lot that I could talk about. I think the main thing I would say, and maybe we could pick that up in the future at another event, but the main, there's the counter-revolution is also very powerful, and it's also making the future of our revolution unknown. There's a lot that I could talk about. In fact, I was really struck by Leila's presentation, because so much of the economic conditions, particularly, or the economic ecosystem that she described in relation to Syria is quite familiar, actually, to me as a Sudanese. The extractive economies, the illegal looting, the predatory governance, the way that these networks function, but also the inflation issue. I mean, I want to point out that in Sudan, she had mentioned the inflation rate in Syria over the past year. In Sudan, I think since December, we've had an inflation rate of about 250% just since December. So it's, there's a lot that makes, that is very familiar to me. But given how brief my time is, I want to just use this opportunity to focus on one issue that I feel does not usually get enough attention when we speak about these struggles, and when we really have a moment like this where we can look back but also look forward. And that's the issue of refugees and exiles. So when thinking about the future of both the Syrian and the Sudanese revolutions, as well as the revolutions in the rest of the region and the uprisings and the low-scale struggles that are happening across the region, I think the issue of migration and refugee rights should be really central to our own analysis and to our own praxis. So let me use the example of Syrian refugees in Sudan to illustrate my point. The UN estimates that there are about 100,000 Syrian refugees in Sudan, but informal estimates put this number at closer to 250,000. After the war started in Syria, and from 2015 on, Sudan became a destination for Syrians that were fleeing the brutality. And there was a very important reason for this. I mean, it's not necessarily logical to go to a country that is also, suffers from conflict, but of course, in that desperation, there was something very important that Sudan offered, and that was that it was the only, I mean, I've read in reports, I'm not sure if this is the case, but certainly it's the only, or one of the only countries in the world where Syrians did not need a visa to travel post 2011. And the lack of a visa requirement not only made Sudan an important destination for those fleeing war and persecution in Syria, but also somewhere where families could reunite occasionally, because you could also travel there, for example, for weddings and so forth. And despite the very difficult economic conditions in Sudan that the Sudanese also face, Sudan became an option for many Syrians to try to start a new life, especially since this policy went beyond the visa policy to make it possible for Syrians to also enroll in the education system, use the healthcare system. I say healthcare system in quotes because it's really inadequate, but there was access to it, and then also to be able to gain work permits. So in some ways, it was a lifeline for many. This changed at the end of 2020. So I really want to emphasize this, because this changed not during the al-Bashir regime. This changed actually since the revolution. So with this new government that is a mix of civilians and military, essentially the transitional government of Sudan decided to revoke this policy, as well as review all citizenships handed by the al-Bashir regime over the last 2 decades to people of non-Sudanese origin. Of course, the al-Bashir regime was notoriously corrupt, so it was a well-known fact that you could buy citizenship, or that citizenship was granted to people for different reasons. But essentially, what this transitional government did extremely abruptly, with very little warning, is that it revoked not only the policy, but more than 3,500 passports that it said had been obtained illegally over the past 30 years, many of them actually in the last 5 or 7 years. And most of those are reportedly belong to Syrians. We don't actually have the breakdowns, but this is what has been reported. So what I want to point out here is that not only the abruptness of this, of course, the fact that it took some people were literally en route or in transit from Syria to Sudan when this happened, others became trapped. But also, what I want to point out here is that part of the ability of the government to do this was built in part on the Assadist discourse that seeks to paint all those who oppose it or who flee the country as members of Daesh. And that was an easy case to make in Sudan because, of course, the al-Bashir regime was an Islamist regime. So with this very broad brush, this was the discourse that underpinned not officially, but unofficially underpinned this move and its legitimation. And there was really not much of an opposition to this discourse, I feel. So just to end, I mean, I brought up this example because I think as we reflect on the futures of our struggles, and I would say our joint struggles, I want to say that we really have to center an internationalist solidarity with refugees across our borders. And really with those movements that we are a part of and those movements that we are supporting, we really have to build up a counter discourse to this kind of legitimation discourse that allows the ability to, take away rights or do it in a way that actually further victimize people who are already victimized by these regimes. And that we really have to grow consciousness across the region on the joint conditions of exile, economic, social, or political that we face. So today you find the Sudanese facing incredibly inhumane treatment by the Sisi regime in Egypt, incredibly inhumane. Syrians facing horrendous conditions in Lebanon and in multiple countries across the region. Palestinians facing this everywhere for decades. Yemen is facing it in the Gulf region and so on. So I want to really point out to the fact that the detention issue, which Wafa so movingly spoke about, it also intersects with the refugee issue, because there are many refugees and exiles who end up thrown in prison in these countries where they are there languishing for decades with no help, and where they were supposed to have found refuge. I think I'll stop here, but yeah, thank you very much. Thank you again.
Madam Abbas, that was amazing. That was well said, and I think you hit a lot of incredible points for us to reflect on, especially what's going on with intersectionality of refugee rights, prison systems, and these regimes, and how they coordinate and learn from each other to control the movement of people and demonize them.
Yazan, if I may just add one very brief thing that I think is also very important to mention. Of course, part of the sort of privileged, I would say, the fact that under the Bashir regime, the Syrians had relatively better policy conditions is partly built on the kind of Arab supremacist ideology of the regime, right? So the Eritreans and the Ethiopians, who some of them were born there and had been there for 30 years, never received that. So I think it's also part of our struggles that we have to, battle and fight for these rights across the board to everyone. And I think that is also very important to add and to say. Sorry.
I'm so glad. No, I'm so glad, and please do more interruptions like that. That was amazing. And I so wholeheartedly agree and want to assert, I mean, looking at it from the Syrian dynamic, there is a lot of things in terms of a relationship with our with our Sudanese comrades that is an utter failure and shortcomings on our part, whether it's from the Arab supremacy, racism, relationships between different governments, and so on. So it's something that we really need to reckon with in order to move forward, because like you said, our struggles are intertwined and we're fated. We're together, no matter what. And we need to work together and understand that. And I'm so happy that you honor us by participating and bringing this up. Thank you so much, Sara. In light of building off what was our previous speaker's talk about solidarity, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, who is Shireen Akram-Boshar. She's an activist, a graduate from Brown University, and an alumni of Students for Justice in Palestine. And who has organized for Palestine solidarity work, as well as the question of the Syrian uprising and links between the two struggles for liberation. She's also a dedicated fighter against sexual and domestic violence and Islamophobia, and is an advocate for the rights of all immigrants, refugees, and progressive movements worldwide. Shireen, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. Kick ass.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this event with so many amazing speakers. So today I'll be speaking briefly about the connections between Palestinian and Syrian struggles for justice and liberation. So it's imperative that we remember, whenever we're working on Syria solidarity or Palestine solidarity activity, that these two struggles, the Palestinian struggle and the Syrian struggle, are linked. And they actually require each other's liberation. Unfortunately, more recently in our accounts of either struggle, the history of these interconnections and the fact that these two struggles need each other, it's sometimes forgotten. So first of all, activists and supporters of either struggle should remember that Palestine has for decades inspired revolts and uprisings across the MENA region, especially during the first and second intifadas of 1987 and 1999. Protest movements in solidarity with these struggles sparked across the MENA region, and the region's regimes repressed them then, just as they repressed each of the 2011 revolutions. The impulse for solidarity and the centrality of solidarity with Palestine could also be seen in the early days of the 2011 revolutions, with Palestinian flags waving alongside Egyptian and Syrian flags in Tahrir Square and other revolutionary squares. It was even more obvious in 2011's Nakba Day, the day that marks the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine on May 15 each year. In 2011, inspired by the revolutions that had just started, Palestinian refugees and others demonstrated at the border with Israel in Syria and Lebanon, and many crossed over into Palestine. So they felt at the time that their return and liberation was actually close and possible in that moment of regional revolt. People across the MENA region see their suffering and plight exemplified through the Palestinian struggle. It represents the oppressive status quo in the region in terms of 70 years of colonialism, Israel being a watchpost for US imperialism, and support by the region's regimes against the will of the vast majority of their peoples. So the peoples across the region see their own oppression, which is also marked by imperialism and US-backed dictatorships and an imperial order mirrored and exemplified by the situation of Palestinians. This is why Algerians, for example, who experienced 150 years of French colonialism, see their struggle as intimately tied to Palestine, both in their colonial past and in their current struggle against their military regime. It's why the Kurds of the region, who've been denied their self-determination and split up by borders, and Egyptians who've had US-backed dictators, and also Syrians who've experienced seemingly unending dictatorships, they have all been inspired to revolt by and in solidarity with Palestine. So while Assad, both Bashar and Hafez actually, they tried to build a narrative about themselves, about their regime as against Israel and against the US, and have therefore been considered anti-imperialist by many members of what I like to think of as the old left, hoping that the new left will be better. And Hafez even framed himself as socialist. The reality is quite the opposite. The regime took part in the US's war on terror, as Wafa and others have spoken about. And specifically, they took part in an extraordinary rendition, which means that the US sent prisoners to Syria for the regime to torture for them. So much for anti-US and anti-imperialist, right? The regime used support for Palestine, like many of the regimes across the region. Rhetorical support for Palestine was an excuse for the regime not to address any of their people's demands for economic or political or social justice. Basically, it was wait for the liberation of Palestine, then we can address impoverishment, massive unemployment, the fact that you have no freedom of speech, etc. So the Assad regime even militarized the country, saying he was doing so to prepare for war with Israel, but Syria actually had the quietest border with Israel for decades. And when the Syrian Revolution began, the regime used this militarization to point its guns against its own people. It became even clearer what the real reason for this militarization was. At the beginning of the 2011 revolution, the regime actually, ironically, also framed and smeared Palestinians, as Wafa actually alluded to, claiming that they were the ones instigating the protests and smearing their demands as illegitimate. And finally, the regime played into Islamophobic war on terror rhetoric at a much larger scale to excuse its brutal massacres of Syrians as well as Palestinians in Yarmouk camp, essentially getting a free pass at massacring and besieging hundreds of thousands of civilians, because the world largely accepts that when it's in the name of fighting terrorism. But it's also important when talking about Syria and Palestine and their shared liberation, it's also important to note that the peoples of the region play an important role, not just because they see themselves as tied to Palestinians, but because Palestinians also require an end to these dictatorships across the region in order to secure their own liberation. Palestinians have been marginalized by Israel, and they're put in marginalized positions in the Israeli economy, very purposefully on Israel's part. And they therefore cannot wage a general strike that could affect the Israeli economy and force it to change its policies, as we've seen in other struggles in the past. And they're also so bifurcated, you know, when you think of the West Bank and Gaza, they're now completely separated. But not only that, they're so bifurcated even within the West Bank by checkpoints and the apartheid wall. They're into now what we call segregated little areas we call Banchistans. So they have little ability to effectively mobilize in their own or create their own cross or regional revolt. So for this reason, Palestinian struggle is crucial, but not enough to secure Palestine's liberation on its own. Instead, regional uprising is even more crucial to break the bonds between Israel and its neighboring regimes, which ignore the fact, as I said before, that the peoples of the region support Palestine and instead are normalizing and have quietly normalized with Israel for decades for their own economic and political gain. So the alliances between reactionary forces like Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Egypt, and the economic normalization that has been increasing in the neoliberal period and includes Syria's regime must all be broken. And that can only be done by successful revolution across the region, like we saw as a possibility in 2011. So we must see revolution across the region as a prerequisite for Palestinian liberation. And we have to support these revolutions, each of these revolutions from Syria to Sudan, and figure out ways to amplify them, to actively support the revolutionaries in any way we can. Just a couple more points. One thing that Syrians and really the world has learned from the Palestinian struggle is the idea of sumud, or steadfastness. We know that this will be a long struggle ahead for each of these revolutions that we've touched on today. Palestinians have been steadfast in resisting Israel's colonization, apartheid, and occupation for 70 years. Many today may not realize that the global solidarity with Palestine only took central stage over the last 15 to 20 years. And it took a long time of building across movements and highlighting the Palestinian struggle and just putting Palestine back on the map to get to this point. This is what Syria solidarity activists should work towards as well. Making Syria solidarity second nature on the left by local and global campaigns that connect to other struggles in the MENA region, as well as to Black Lives Matter, indigenous struggles, and so on. It's worth remembering that in the US and elsewhere, consciousness changed on the issue of Palestine through tens and hundreds of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters at US campuses and their political education and campaigns and other campaigns that came from below, from mass marches and building solidarity with other struggles. I think that's all really crucial. We have to rely on building with other struggles and not, at least not primarily, on appealing to politicians who will not prioritize the liberation we need and want and have in mind. I think something else we've learned from Palestine's struggle is the centrality of the refugee and diaspora population in struggle. So like Palestinians, Syrian refugees are not simply a humanitarian cause, but they're agents who should be involved in movements locally and globally, who have lessons from their own revolutionary struggle, both the successes and their failures, and can inform our other movements, and to be brought into these movements rather than sidelined by the left or ignored by other progressive movements. Finally, I think each of our movements need to be in communication much more, as Sara's presentation reminded me. The Sudanese revolution learned a great deal from the failures of the first round of the 2011 revolutions and made attempts to move beyond these weaknesses and failures. So we must study each other's revolts and uprisings, from starting with the first Intifada and the Second Intifada, to the Sudanese revolution, to Syria's revolution and counter-revolution, so that in the next round of uprisings, we're more successful and able to avoid, mass slaughter, and instead make our own demands a reality. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for that very thorough and robust kind of overview of the connection between Syrian liberation and Palestinian liberation. As you were talking, I was reminded about how the 2011 MENA uprisings really kind of shifted and switched something in me with regards to pan-Arabism. Beforehand, Palestinian liberation was something very central, growing up in my family, like many other people's families. And during the 2011 uprising, something switched because I think that I had done this thing where oh, we're all the same, and I'm getting angry in a way that's a little inappropriate, as if I was Palestinian, instead of making more space for Palestinians and supporting and being an accomplice, and kind of recognizing these dynamics. And it just, we share the same vision. So thank you so much.
And I think it's so important to study our histories and the interconnections, because today we unfortunately are often siloed into either Palestine or Syria instead of seeing them as so interconnected.
And I think the role of Arab nationalism. I think, these regimes, they would say using Israel, which we rightly needed to oppose, but they framed it in a way that this is your only enemy, and kind of using Arab nationalism in that way.
So simply, yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am so pleased to present our next speaker, Banah Ghadbian, who's an award-winning Syrian poet and artist based in the Ozarks. She is published in As/Us, Sukoon, an Arab-themed literary magazine, Aunt Chloe, Afghan punk magazine, Voice and Verse, Her Words, The A Project, Passage and Place, Anthology on Home, and Acting Up, Queer in the New Century Anthology. She's currently a PhD candidate at UC San Diego on Syrian women's creative work in revolution and war. She has sent us a recorded poem that we'll be playing. It seems like we're having some technical let's see. I think we're trying to get the sound to play.
Leave rhythm and sweetness behind. In the revolution, we will need magicians to help us convince the world our lives are worthy enough to. In the revolution, we will need every single poet, rapper, music maker, lover to get together and teach us how to harmonize. In the revolution, we cannot leave rhythm and sweetness behind. In the revolution, we will need magicians to help us convince the world our lives are worthy enough to not be forgotten. We will need librarians and forklift operators. We will need resters, dreamers, carpenters, painters, basket weavers, and little cousins. We will need a lot of worms, love from the plants, enough fire to begin again. The revolution will respect mothers. The revolution will center our loved ones with disabilities. The revolution is like an ancient olive tree, and we humans are small saplings shaded underneath her branches. The revolution will be soft and unafraid. The revolution will be one that honors Earth. 2. In a future Syria, my voice will not be a whisper. في سوريا المستقبل لن يكون رأي همسا. You wrote this line for me, sister. Then they came for you and slit your throat on a Friday afternoon when the sun was out. You kept speaking. You grabbed my hand and said, listen. I felt your voice vibrating from my tongue. I felt your soft whisper in the morning light, and you told me to speak up. What was that movement in the night? Where did we leave off? I heard a chorus of yellow birds singing, one day, one day, one day we'll return to the sea, to Syria, ya Sirena. One day we will come. In a future Syria, we will be sister dancing, brown-eyed, brown skin, full of heaven on our tongues. In a future Syria, Hamza wa Hajar's dreams will burst forth from the sun. In a future Syria, we will greet each other with hoods and ancient lutes. In a future Syria, we will begin the day from the soil of our grandmother's roots. We will remember what we wrote on the fig leaves, the secrets we kept until we'd return. We will remember what we wrote on the leaflets our sisters threw from the university buildings and were tortured for. We will not forget the children, and the top priority on the political agenda will be their laughter. We will burn down the NGOs and make freedom schools out of paper plates, plant damask rose on the path, fill the streets with jacaranda trees, and throw lavender tissue paper out the windows in the breeze. And who could forget the jasmines? Our Constitution will be written from jasmines, and coffee grinds hung on every rooftop clothesline, imprinted on our mirrors in music and calligraphy letters. Our right to return and reconciliation process will be implemented through 12-point drum circle plans and secured by Arabic chewing gum. Each person will be guaranteed silt of the Euphrates, pebbles from the Berada, and an all-access path to the cemeteries to see our loved ones. The temple of Jupiter will be re-sanctified and every explosion reversed. Every dead person will rise up from the soil once we water it, a little bit. They will dance with us, making olive trees our only shelters from the storms.
نساء إدلب اليوم واقفين حتى نأكد إنه الثورة السورية مستمرة ونحن باقون ما بقي أغصان الزيتون والنصر إن شاء الله.
I love Banah's poetry.
That was fantastic. That was good. Thank you, Banah.
Thank you, Banah. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. A lot to chew on here. And I'm also thinking like, yeah, also a few articles that need to be written.
Oh, just to let the audience know, we were looking at the time and we're aiming to keep this at an hour and a half because we know it's very tiring and we appreciate everyone that's involved. Initially, if we had time, we wanted to have a group discussion, but it doesn't seem like we can, just to make it easy for everyone. And I think at least we can have some concluding comments, you and I, if we dare. At least for me, what I can tell from the entire conversation is how important it is for us to work together. I could say personally, as a person in Beirut, and watching what's happened in the past 10 years, I think we all deserve better from the so-called intellectuals and leaders and people that have dominated the discourses about our movements. The people on the ground deserve better. We need a better left. We need better progressives. Our causes are tied together, whether it's in Bahrain or Syria or Yemen, Sudan, and beyond. We need to start thinking globally. As one speaker pointed out, these regimes and these imperialist states, and it's not just the US, it's the US and other states, are killing us all. We can see this, whether aggressively in war zones like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, or we can see this in peacetime with the type of controls and type of stripping of rights of human beings, whether we've seen it with the African American community and what they faced. We've seen it in other places, like in Bolivia and in Venezuela, whether it's by, the US, the CIA, or, these so-called anti-imperialist states. So I think if there's one takeaway for the future that I hope audiences can have is that, and allow me to be a bit vulgar, we should stop fucking around. We need to work together and we need to do better for our movement. People deserve this, frankly.
I would add, Yazan, that we need to work together strategically.
Agreed. Oh, yes.
I think that there's and I would say we need to do that more, because I don't want to erase the work of the people. Like, I think people have been working together strategically, and that it needs to be done more. Speaking as someone who's based in the United States, who was active on campaigns for workers' rights and Palestinian solidarity before 2011, and then after 2011, was trying to organize, with the Syrian revolutionary spirit here in the United States. And when I say Syrian revolutionary spirit, I mean really the Syrian revolution is about reclaiming local politics, and really taking ownership of your locality politically, and in a way that's democratic, and allows people to have a voice, have a say, safely. That just if you speak out, then you'll get thrown in prison. In how politics are happening locally. When I tried to do that in the United States, it was extremely challenging, because to work locally in the United States, you're working locally in a settler colony. And so what I would say for other US-based people who have the shared principles of the Syrian Revolution and the other revolutions that we're seeing around the world, that to start locally, we're playing a long game here, because we are a settler colony, and we also need folks. It's very dangerous. This isn't easy work, but I do think about the comrades in Russia, because it's the U.S. is not the sole imperial agent in the world. I do think about our comrades in China, and I think about. I think about changing the face of U.S. internationalism, so that when you guys also look at what we're doing here, you see our frontline actors as Black and Indigenous folks who have been, on their communities have been decimated by the police and prisons here. And we're playing a long game here. And I thank the work of everyone who's been kind of trying to work as strategically as possible with shared principles. I know there are things that we can't afford a long game on some things. It's very costly to play a long game. That long game means people are going to be dying, and they are dying, and they're going to. And so, yeah, as much as we can help each other kind of deal, this is like very trauma-laden work, deal so that we can do long-term and short-term work. And I just like, I think everyone here who spoke today is in it for the long term. Thank you.
To jump into that, I think your point about reminding everyone that this is for the long term, that these struggles are a process. And even then, with victories, there is always a process and struggle in the victories. And it's something that one of the speakers, Wafa, wants to share, and I also would like to add to it, is this mentality that, you know, a fatalism towards the future, that Syria is doomed, which I understand because of all what happened to it, and there is no hope for the future. And to echo what Sara, what Wafa had pointed out, is that it's a sort of luxury to give up, that there is power in hope and working and trying and striving and struggling. And one of the messages I think that is important to outline here with what we did today is that the future is open. It's not set in stone. And we should remember that the future can be ours. It's not theirs. It's not these regimes, these elites, these people with power. We can take it, and we can never forget that. And I hope that's one thing, at least, that people can have comfort, whether it's cold comfort, but it's something that we can use out of spite. You know, at least we can use spite against these bastards. So if we can remember at least that our future is open and we have the future, that's something that we can always fight with. And they can never take that away from us.
Thanks, Yazan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And we hope you had enjoyed this event. And and hopefully we'll plan other events like this. Just to say that we are just a group of volunteers. As you can tell with the technical difficulties, we have no CIA funding. I just want to assure some people. If we had CIA funding, then we wouldn't have technical difficulties. Believe me, we'd be having those nice, awesome, stylish production that the CIA are always renowned for. But thank you very much, everyone. Sorry for that lame joke.
Not